Beast. A story by user Jake the Snake Bake Cake. Chapter 1. The union of intelligent life had grown dramatically in all directions for hundreds of thousands of years, long enough for its founders to evolve, diverge, and become different species entirely. It was more ancient than any known intelligent life, and in a way had taken a life of its own. It was a symbolic torch in the infinity that had been passed through the ages by those who had come to warm in its light. Standing the tests of time was one thing, but standing through the rise and fall of its founders and those that came after was entirely another. The Union was considered to be immortal. All things have an end. That is one simple truth in a universe which offers no true explanations. Moons will leave their orbits. Stars will die. Light will fade off into the unknown. Despite their prosperity and strengths, empires will fall. The Union is no different in this. Of course, it is accepted that the Union would end, but only in a far-off future when the universe itself has come to be nothing but dust. The first true threat to the union of intelligent life came from outside the known galaxy. A simple rock that eons ago had left its own system in search of another. There is no telling how long it took for the rock to come into contact with another occupied section of space, only that eventually it did. That simple asteroid was the carrier of death, plague, and ruthlessness. Perhaps it had finished its purpose from whence it came, and had finally reached its new challenge. Perhaps it was simply a fluke of chance, formed by impossibly unlikely circumstances. It is not known for certain, for no known intelligent life can go beyond this galaxy and live to reach another. The void is too vast. It spread in a simple fashion, not dangerous or even alive. It simply replicated with efficiency, seemingly benign. The races that encountered it treated it as an oddity, not a threat. Slowly it spread, and not outward. It spread down, deep below the surface of its new home. Analysis showed that it continued until it was capable of replication on a logarithmic scale. It remained so until some conditions were met, and the entire inner core had been consumed. And then it revealed its true colors. The trigger was pulled seemingly at random to those who inhabited the surface of the planet, and they stood no chance. Life was but a tool for it to wield in its goals, and not a well-treated one. Consume, destroy, continue. Simple luck was all that held it in place. Simple circumstance was the reason the Union had time to react. The quarantined zone had been placed to stop the spread towards the Union border, and the methods of their entire fleet forced it back. Entire systems were wasted in this effort, and the Union had been forced to glass and encase hundreds of primitive planets, reduce the surface to magma, encapsulate by a massive skynet, and then irradiate for hundreds of cycles. This process was perfected by necessity, as several of the first planetary bodies had almost breached through their ever-growing lines in secondary outbursts. Those had almost pieced into the center of life itself, and ended it all. Intelligent life had never been encountered in the sections of the infected zone, and primitive organic life was considered to be an acceptable loss when compared to the whole of the Union. Of course, as they continued to push the spread back and away, they explored far past their boundaries. It was only a matter of time until their scouts reached System 849. For the good of the many, at the cost of the few, the containment held. The funny thing about regaining consciousness after cryosleep was how you cried. The toughest men and women alive, those who could take anything the universe had to throw at them, would sob tears like little babies. It wasn't pain either, it was just some weird reaction. Hard-ass, big, muscular men would all have a moment of bonding as they cried their eyes out and tried not to look at one another. When you woke up from cryosleep, you were subconsciously trained to check a list of factors. First the pulse, then the wrist, There was always a standardized tattoo of specialized ink that was designed to fade with a set half-life, and would accurately show an individual how long they had been under for. Somehow you would just know to look, and somehow you would just know what it meant. Memory conditioning was a bizarre concept. Here he lay, knowing all of that, but not the obvious. Where the hell was he? The conditioned thought breezed by his fog-filled mind as the activation enzymes took effect. Long-term memory loss is common and temporary after cryo. That was all well and good, but what was not common was the serious, unrelenting pain, and the panic that was coming with it. Pain was not normal. Something must have gone wrong. His tattoo was wrong. It made no sense. There was no way it could be what it was unless there had been some kind of mistake. What the fuck was going on? The pain was unbearable. His head throbbed as though it was set to burst, and his arms and legs felt numb with needle-stabbing pulses flickering through them. He seized up once, twice. He flopped in the containment of his pod as though he was embracing death. It lasted an eternity, and he knew nothing, remembered nothing, and was surrounded by pure pain and terror as his body fought itself in fits and bursts. His life could have ended, begun anew, and ended again before it all finally ceased. A calm akin to ecstasy washed over him. Any sensation other than pain meant life, and life was welcome. Cold could be felt, along with his heartbeat which pulsed through his chest. The pressure pumped behind his eyes, under his scalp, to his toes. Consciousness seemed to grow a little more with each steady beat, bringing with it the knowledge that whatever had hit him just then had been survived. Somehow. That didn't change the fact that something was amiss. In the way that you turn to realize you're about to crash, or you've taken a bad step, something was very wrong. His brain felt slow and knotted. All thoughts seemed to bend back on themselves, and no recognition was surfacing but the conditioning. The worst part was that too was fading. But it was shouting at him as it left. Something was wrong. Where was he? As the man sat up, he found that he was in a glass box, edged with metal along its angles. It stood as an almost perfect cube. Beyond the cube was simply more metal, and a series of lights which flashed at regular rhythms. Bleary-eyed, he stared in mild confusion. This wasn't his ship. But as he tried to recollect what his ship would look like, he realized he simply could not. He sat in a metal pod that seemed to chill the air around it, and pour off a strange white cloud over its edges. Markings covered it, dents and scrapes, letters that he recognized but couldn't seem to read. There were similar markings on his wrist, but they seemed wrong. For some reason he felt as though he was at the butt end of a sick joke. Wiping tears from his eyes, he noticed that his skin was bare, pale and white from the cold. It glowed within the cube's strange light. For the exception of some loose shorts around the waist, his flesh was naked. There was no recognition at all. Confused, he sent for his memories, for anything at all to explain his situation, and met nothing but a wall. No acknowledgement, no information. It was as if he at this very moment had just been born from a snapshot. Details were there, but no background, no depth. A migraine worse than hell itself struck him as he tried again to recollect himself, causing his already blurry vision to sway. When it calmed, he realized he was no longer alone. Hairs on his bare skin began to rise. Somehow he knew that response was ancient and residual, serving no purpose. He dared not try to chase down the knowledge now, though, as sounds triggered alertness and he turned to face them. It was from this instinct that brought the man to attention, face to face with a terrifyingly ugly creature. It was that same instinct that then forced him to hold his gaze. Fight or flight. The coin was tossed to land on its side in perfect balance. The thing that stared at him, through the glossy texture of his cube, was skinned like that of a frog. The face was scrunched in on itself, and folds of slick skin creased along it. There were spikes that seemed to cover random sections of its strange skin with no perpendicular nature, and organs that bore no flashing glimmer of recognition. 4 legs, and then 4 smaller limbs were what sprouted from its strange torso and molded shoulders. It seemed to be spread too narrowly for any true physical work, but moved with graceful ease. Each scuttling series of steps caused it to jiggle beneath its green and black skin. The man could see what appeared to be organs and faintly luminescent flesh rippling in unison. Faintly translucent flesh rippling in unison. This was a very strange way to wake up. The man blankly reached his hand through a faint beard of brown hair in a movement that could only be attributed to muscle memory. He tried again to remember where he had been before he woke up, but the crushing headache returned and he grimaced in pain. Despite all his efforts, he could barely remember anything at all. The creature stared at the human in the cube with what would register as disgust, no matter where in the universe you came from, before waddling away. It seemed to snort out a gurgle of what the man guessed was some type of speech, as it headed toward the left side of the room. Occasionally stopping to fiddle with small holographic displays that appeared, the creature went about its strange tasks. In front of the room, sliding doors blurred with an unnerving sound as 4 more of the creatures funneled in. Each specimen was varying shades of green and black, and each slightly illuminated by their own innards. The man tried to speak then. He focused his thoughts despite his throbbing head, but nothing came out. In shock, the man felt at his throat, and encountered the smooth texture of scar tissue. He was a mute. He looked down at his skin and saw several more spread out in his arms, chest, and legs. Something had happened. Something had gone wrong. If only he could remember how he had gotten here. He tried again and again in vain to speak, but still no words would fall from his lips, only air. The gasping rasps of it billowed a fog in front of him, as the warm air met the chilled room. The creatures seemed to find this amusing, because they quickly turned to one another and began complex gestures with their arms, waving in a mix of sign language and short, quick gurgles. They were quite amused by the behavior of their captive. Their amusement died as quickly as it came, though. As the humans stood up and attempted to touch the glass walls of its confinement, their amusement turned to panic. They didn't find that funny at all. In fact, they found it terrifying as they scrambled with their holographic displays, their strange limbs hitting holographic buttons in a frenzy. The air in the cube seemed to thin, and immediately the man found his legs collapsing, his lungs gasping in vain. The creatures scuttled around in the edges of his vision, their short bursts of guttural speech fading to black with the rest of the human's perception. Perhaps this was hell. Ytale led her spawn through the crowded staging area with cautioned grace, as her cloak billowed with the resistance of air currents. It was the first meeting of the cycle, and the best goods were on display around them, for purchase or exchange. Activity was everywhere the eye could see. Behind them, a multitude of ships docked and took off with the speed of automated guidance systems, and in all other directions were simply booths and shops containing anything one could want, legally or otherwise. The traders' gathering was tradition, and had been for at least 40,000 cycles. Held in neutral space between 2 sections of militarized border zones, it was the mecca of unsavory types and entrepreneurs alike. Hundreds of species partook in the event, and hundreds more supplied it. Weapons, assets, business partners, food, the list stretched on as far as the imagination. If you wanted something, this was the correct place and time to find it. This was especially true if what you were looking for wasn't technically legal. Above the crowd, winged species buzzed and glided, occasionally meeting at small levitating platforms with booths set up to mimic the lower levels, and with displays floating along below them. Holographic images portrayed action, places, and flashes of text. Product advertisements, sales pitches, and traveling opportunities were abundant. There were shouts and screams, sellers and hagglers, thieves and enforcers. An entire mix of these hustled and bustled in the gathering. Above all, though, there were the traders of the guild. All of this was ignored by the small group weaving through the masses. They passed through like ghosts, with streamlined ease as they half walked, half sidestepped their way towards their destination. Of all the offers that surrounded them, only one mattered. They had come with a single purchase in mind, and there was only one place within the Union's vast reach that they would be able to find it. The leader of their group wore a scaled cloak and a thin gray uniform beneath it. Pure blue eyes and soft features gave off a beautiful impression. By her own kind standards, she was quite stunning, and she prided her appearance. It was one of the few things she had left. With a casual gesture, she reached to her side and felt the weight that hung there. It was safe, still buckled to her uniform and untouched. A quick glance behind her confirmed that the other two were also still with her, and their panicked looks brought a smile to her throat. She remembered her first trip to the traders' gathering all too well, and was proud they were at least keeping the posture of someone calm. She had almost run screaming back onto the ship when she had been in their position. As she led them closer to their destination, the crowd thinned. Slowly, the rows of booths and shops cut off and revealed the open floor of the giant structure, which was pure and slick metal. They had made good time wading through the masses, and had been right to leave the crew to mind the ship at port. Too many more would have slowed them down. They were late as it was already, and it was likely the auction would already have started. Approaching the doors with confidence, she nodded in acknowledgement at the two armed guards which held post on both sides, and covered in overlapping sections of hard chitin and spikes. Yroll knew immediately that they were carnivorous. Their four-pieced serrated jaws confirmed any doubt she had at first glance, and at their sides were shock rifles branded with the Traders' Union seals. The guild had spared no expense this cycle on hired muscle, or chitin for that matter. Loud slurping and clicking emanated from the strange jaws as they choppily acknowledged her, and she stopped to meet their gaze before giving a single nod. Slowly, one of the guards hit a hollow pad on the wall, opening the gates to the private showing. The Traders' Guild took this extremely seriously, and she knew that without her cloak marking her as a shipmaster, she wouldn't have gotten much farther. The creatures likely would have been happy to incapacitate them at the slightest provocation. She had seen similar circumstances on previous trips cycles ago with her life-mate. The cloak she wore had been his. Behind the cloak, her spawn murmured uncomfortable songs of mild panic, which she hushed with a single note of confidence. She had come to get them a guardian beast, and she would not leave until she obtained one. For their sake and hers, the risks could be damned. Everything that mattered was riding on it. When he awoke again, he was bound hand and foot, but he was not in agony. For that he was thankful, even if his limbs were restricted by some strange type of metal cuffs. Hands held in front and feet sealed together, the man was propped up at a slight angle in another case. It was spherical this time, and that gave him room to stretch as he relished in the feeling of being alive. Being alive and not in pain was a wonderful thing. It took him a full minute for him to realize that he was on display. To either side of the human were dozens of other creatures held in captivity, ranging in shape and size, texture and composition. Some of the larger creatures seemed to throw themselves against the cages in rage, while many of the others simply screamed in primal anger. None of them seemed interested in anything but the glass which contained them. It was a disturbing zoo straight out of a nightmare, and he was stuck in the middle of it. Quietly, he sat in his strange glass bubble. It wasn't as though he had much of a choice in the matter, being bound and mute, but he did it on his own terms. Peacefully, he observed as the chaos that surrounded the sphere which contained him rose like the crescendo of an orchestra. He couldn't remember what an orchestra was, but it seemed a fitting description. Even through the strange glass, the noise was enormous, and his ears rang with the volume of it. Light filled the space in which the prisoners sat with a sudden burst, and the overwhelming noise cut off and found itself replaced by a deep calm. Though the creatures imprisoned around him still appeared to be screaming, not a single sound escaped their pods. Even as some of their violent lashings ricocheted off the translucent barriers that held them, no sign of it emerged on the outside. Slowly the human stood, carefully so as to maintain his balance, staring outwards to face what seemed to go in every direction for as far as he could see. There was a crowd, and it was massive. All different sizes and shapes were present, and they stared right on back, at him, at the others. Those on display were the center of attention in what resembled a giant arena of some kind. Some variety stood in the crowd, but soon he realized that most were the same species with a speckling of others mixed in. As the light seemed to rotate around the stage, he caught a better view. They were beautiful creatures. Unlike his fellow captives on stage, these seemed refined and graceful. Their skin was covered in a light fur that seemed to shift by individual with variation from blue to green. They stood on 2 legs which appeared to be jointed in a similar manner as his own, and moved with light steps as they milled about themselves. Their shape was humanoid but for their tails, which seemed to wrap around each one like a lazy serpent that moved on its own time. Squinting as he tried to see in greater detail, the man pressed his nose to the glass, but light directed into his face before anything more could be made out. It almost blinded him, and his vision blurred with the after-image of the powerful display. Resisting the light, he turned at an angle and tried to see through it. There wasn't anything more than faint outlines of the beings off of the elevated stage, but from what he had seen, they reminded him of elves. Elves? What the heck were elves? Another migraine rocked him before he could find an answer to that. The throbbing echoed in the back of his skull, a constant reminder of his predicament. Strange melodies seemed to hum over the light, and glass prisons moved forward without any obvious mechanisms to come to a halt abruptly once again. One at a time, the cases on the farthest level began to move on to the edge of the stage, bringing their frenzied inhabitants with them. After his fellow captives moved forward, one by one they seemed to levitate and float away. Each was sent in a different direction, their glass spheres like giant bubbles gliding off over the crowd with ease. As this continued, the man observed one pod land near the stage. It opened and unceremoniously dumped its captive onto the ground below. The crowd had parted immediately, and 2 figures bearing long rods of metal stood next to the hairy creature that lay on the ground. The crowd continued to back away, and formed an empty pocket in the seemingly endless crowd. The 2 figures and the creature were now alone. The creature had several appendages unfamiliar to the man, but many of them resembled trunks or large, thick tails. These lashed out like heavy clubs as it tried to fight its captors. Darting side to side in sluggish leaps, it seemed unsteady as it flailed and tumbled about. The armed figures moved with tactical skill in sharp contrast to the beast, and it failed to land a single blow on them as they danced around it. Out of its pod, the beast's screams were audible over the murmur of the crowd as it seemed to squeal and grunt in random choppy outbursts. It tired quickly as it flailed, and finally came to a stop, heaving in ragged breaths. It slowly turned, trying to keep the 2 figures in sight. Apparently, those figures had simply been trying to get in range because the strange engagement ended abruptly. A loud crack ripped out as the beast was promptly zapped with a ball of light from the end of one of the metal rods. The beast fell to the floor in an instant, and was dragged away without further resistance towards a group of figures waiting near the edge of the crowd. They tossed the thing into a hovering cage, and the crowd refilled around them. The cage slowly pushed away from the stage towards what he could only guess were exits. It dawned on the human then in sudden clarity. They were being auctioned to the highest bidders. Like a commodity, he and these other creatures were being purchased, and for what purpose he did not know. The man tried to shout then, but again no sound came from his scarred throat. Whatever damage had been done was likely permanent, and he realized grimly that he would have to face this in silence. It was decided then that he would listen. There was nothing else one could do but observe and learn when all other means of interaction were stolen. He felt as though his survival would depend on this, and used this new purpose to squash down the fear that was beginning to rush upon him in waves. Those waves crashed harder as the spotlights began to dim out, one after another. The stage darkened as other creatures were sold and transported away. None outmatched the figures that waited for them upon their release from the spheres. Soon it was his turn, and the pod seemed to accelerate forward to the edge of the stage in a strange sensation, like walking forward on an escalator. He heard with clarity the melody of a deep voice which seemed to hum forth quick notes of languages unfamiliar. He was going to be sold, and for what purpose he could only imagine. Thoughts of fleeing came to him, but the bonds on his legs kept him from seriously considering it an option. He was truly stuck. He focused on the quieter voices in the distance, and tried to squint towards their direction. The melodies seemed to fight from other sides of the crowd with occasional dissonance, and more often than not they interrupted one another. They were most certainly bidding on him. As he tried to peer through the light, he could make out more details. Now, on the very edge of the platform, he found that he could see the first few individuals in the crowd with reliable detail. Again, they reminded him of elves, if elves had long tails and a thin layer of fur. Some few seemed to wear scales around them, many of which glittered and reflected in the light. But most wore slick plastic-like suits around their body and limbs. Their eyes were one solid hue as if they possessed nothing but an iris. Beautiful but strangely intimidating. The dissonant melodies died suddenly, and his pod lifted off the ground in a sudden leap of speed that had him struggling to remain standing. His legs and arms were still bound by the alien cuffs and made it all but impossible to ready himself. This was especially apparent when the prison touched down in a deceivingly rough fashion. He fell forward and suddenly wisped through the glass as though it had been made of air. Instinctively he curled in a ball to protect his head, but found that his fall was much slower than expected. With graceful ease he landed on his feet, despite his cuffs. The creatures around him murmured in quiet, beautiful melodies that he could only guess were astonishment. He too stared at the ground in awe, and realized that he felt as though he weighed barely anything. His body was light as a feather here, and every ripple of motion seemed to be magnified because of it. Almost 6 feet tall, the man was not a light individual. Perhaps 25 years of age, it was obvious that he had spent many of those years in physical activity. Fit and large, the human felt used to being heavy, and had grown strength to accommodate for it. Now, suddenly, it was as if the weight of his very existence had been lifted from him. He didn't know for certain, but he was confident that he had never felt so graceful in his life. That body of dense muscle and weight might as well have been made out of air. The man looked up to see 2 guards with the shock staffs approaching cautiously. Their tails were raised behind them, and they twitched similar to that of a predator stalking its prey. As the man came to his wits, he tried to walk, but fell, forgetting for an instant that his feet were bound. His grace was lost as quickly as it had been gained, and he fell forward to land on his face. A shock hit his back with searing pain, and his damaged throat tried to scream. The guards had interpreted his action as resistance, and another shock hit him in the side when the first failed to have the desired effect. That agony immediately turned to rage. With seething anger and frustration, the man flexed his muscles to the bursting point and felt something crack. Legs broke their cuffs and sent pieces of the strange material scattering in different directions. Hammering his cuffs down onto his knees, the arm cuffs followed shortly after. The guards had leapt back in shock, and their songs quickened to sharp notes as they began to circle. This was obviously not something that had happened often to them, and the crowd that surrounded the 3 was turning into a milling struggle. Some tried to leave while others came to watch the show. The humans stared at the crowd, and then down the break past them where his assumed purchasers stood. There were 3 of them, and they seemed uneasy at the moment. It appeared they had gotten more than they bargained for. The crowd had parted even further now as more guards had come rushing to the scene. Strange staffs angled and ready. At this point, there wasn't anyone else within 20 feet in any direction besides the 3 uneasy purchasers and the guards. He turned towards the ones not pointing weapons at his person. If they had purchased him, they likely didn't want him injured before he served his purpose, whatever that purpose was. Slowly, the man walked forward, and the guards seemed to relax. Under their direction, he allowed himself to be led towards the 3 unarmed beings. Perhaps they could work out some type of understanding. 2 were smaller, children perhaps, but one was large enough to stand up to the man's shoulder, and wore one of the strange scaled cloaks he had seen scattered about the crowd. It was only slightly smaller than the 2 guards who held their staffs in an uneasy manner as they circled behind him, but looked more feminine and far more refined. Its posture stood in confidence, despite the uneasy movements of its tail, which whipped like a cat's before the pounce. As he reached the 3 aliens, the 2 smaller ones seemed to hide behind their elder, shying away from his presence. The man met its solid blue eyes and studied it. Its dark blue eyes peered back, and they did not leave. The strange cloak which wrapped around its shoulders seemed to hide a mane of longer hair which traveled down from its head to the length of its tail, shortening as it went until it blended with the rest of the pale blue hair on its body before its end. It was strangely pretty, and the man found himself beginning to relax with the familiarity of its features. This was far safer looking than the previous alien races he had witnessed, and it seemed to push at his memory, to bring some type of recognition. A rustle from beneath the scaled cape brought out a silver collar, which the creature slowly reached out with. The man started to raise his hands in front of him to attempt to stop the motion, whatever that was. It wasn't going on him until he had some answers. Well, he got them pretty quick. Immediately, 2 shocks hit his ribs from either side, and the collar cracked onto his neck as he fell to his knees. A tingle began to surge from it immediately. In his neck, it seemed spread like stabbing needles deep into his skin as it fused with his body. The man tried to rise, trying desperately to slip his fingers underneath the device and pry it off. But the creature quickly stepped back and raised one of her 6-fingered hands to her opposing wrist. Pain flooded through his entire body. Such unbelievable pain, as if fire was surging through every nerve, every fiber of his being. He fell forward to his knees again, wobbled slowly, and then hit the floor. Darkness took him, and he was thankful that he felt nothing after that. Oh man, it's kind of a rough grammar and syntax and many other things, but it is a fantastically richly thought of similes and metaphors in this. Like, the guy writing it may not have the best writing, but he has really good writing. I don't know how to explain that. Like, it's just the way that he thinks of things is really different than you would typically look at something, the way he tries to say things, and I really like that. But this is chapter 1 of Beast, and it doesn't have an ending still, even after 4 years. Hopefully one day Jake the Snake bake a cake. Hopefully one day.